Well, 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 are you as busy as I am this time of year? I was thinking about this. It's not common for me to record stories. I usually come into classrooms and I get to know people and get to know their faces and recognize them when I go places. And I was free to go to Walmart, or I was free to go to the grocery store. And I always saw somebody, some of you would come up, "Miss, aren't you the story lady?" And I would feel so honored that you would know me and remember me, because this is something, I told you early on this year that I've been doing this is my 20th year to be the story lady. And I got to thinking, what do boys and girls know about Christmas? And of course, you and I both know what the true celebration for Christmas is. And we don't want to lighten that, because that's a very significant thing to our faith. And it makes us know how we can appreciate the birthday of our Lord. And everybody knows the story about what went on according to how it's written in the Bible. The Bible is an awe-inspiring book, but it's a collection, let's say it that way, an anthology, a collection of many, many different stories with more or less a central idea. And almost everything that we learn about in the world today is kind of like that. We pigeonhole ideas and put, this is about Christmas and this is about Easter. And I never did get around to telling you the story of that went along with the story of Valentine's Day and how it. So every occasion has somebody that has a collection of experiences, or you might say a collection of ideas, or just a collection of information that they think is very important, they want to pass on to another generation. Or maybe it's great concepts. You know what that word is? A concept is just a highfalutin way that you can say a very important idea that could change people in their behavior pattern or their lifestyle pattern. A concept is have been passed on by storytellers from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Do you know we got our ideas on democracy about 2,000 years ago in that little bitty country called Greece? And they began to write those ideas down, not on paper and pencil like we do, but they took a chisel and a big block of rock and hammered those ideas down in that rock, because they thought it was so important that people 2,000 years later might pick up and read about what our ideas of democracy is, or how we feel politically about things, or how we feel morally, that's a good word, morally about things. And so when we think about the Bible, of course we think that it's a really about 50-something books that tells us about our spiritual life as Christian people. And most of us in the United States, many of us, are Christian people. So, it's been hammered in rock, and then it's been copied and recopied and painted and glorified. Today, we pick up a book, a Bible, and on Sunday morning go to worship and talk about the things that happened 2,000 years ago. And that's very important. An anthology is, as I told you before, is just a collection. I've got an old book here that is really, really important to me. It might not be important to you, but because I tell stories, I'm always going into old bookstores everywhere and looking for anthologies that would have like a bunch of fairy tales or a bunch of stories about history or a bunch of stories about how to raise. Every group that has a primary interest that's very important will have their anthology. And this is an old anthology that I found in a bookstore in Florence, Alabama, one day when I was just walking through. Actually, it was more or less a junk store. But when I saw it says Tales Told Under the Christmas Tree, I thought, that's what I've been looking for. Because in my stories that I used to go into schools and all, I usually leave the spiritual stories to church and the Sunday school teachers, but I, of course, saying very strongly that I do believe the stories of Christmas, but finding 3 stories like this, I find stories that are absolutely a surprise to me, and people are very, very adept at telling those stories over and over again. So I told Pap when I was a little girl, remember I go to Nanny Sides, or I did, every afternoon because she made such wonderful tea cakes. And he told us stories that, and remember, I don't know whether you remember or not, he was born in 1853, which means he was born about 7 years before the Civil War ever tore our country apart and rearranged our thinking about many, many things like the evils of slavery and all of the things that they... So I said, Pap, what in the world did y'all do at Christmas time? How did y'all celebrate? He looked at me. Remember now, at that time, Pap was a very old man. He was pushing 100 years old. Actually, he was about 97, 98, somewhere in that vicinity. He said, well, he always had a chawbaccy in his mouth because he was a Kentucky boy, and they raised a lot of tobacco in Kentucky. He had a big chaw of tobacco, and he leaned over and kind of leaned over the banister and went spit that tobacco juice off through the kudzu vines to the ground out there. He said, it sure weren't like it is today. Said, you young'uns, you don't know what it was like. He said, in fact, we went to church and we did a lot of worshiping at church and such like as that. But we might go out and cut us a pine tree or something, or a cedar tree, and take it inside. We might string a little popcorn with a needle and thread at night, sitting down and drape it around the Christmas tree. Or we might do ribbons and make chains at the table out of some pretty fancy paper that somebody had brought in, wrapped around a piece of candy or something. Oh, we love to find an old cigarette pack back there, because you know what was in the middle of that? They wrapped those cigarettes in tin foil. It wasn't aluminum foil, because aluminum had not been invented at that time. It was tin foil, and they would peel that tin foil out and use it and make something like icicles to put on the tree, something to catch a feller's eye. And he said, now we knew better because to expect a lot, but we'd go out gathering hickory nuts in these big old hickory trees, and we'd get them by the basket full because there weren't many pecans. Now there's pecans down in South Alabama, but up here in this area, you very seldom find a big pecan tree with a great big crop of pecans on it. But we'd start cracking nuts long about October. And we always would have this old brick over by the fireplace, and it'd have a hole worn in it where we'd crack so many hickory nuts. Hickory nuts is hard to crack. and you'd have to take a hammer or a mallet or something and put it in that little hole and whop it, and then you'd pick out the nut meat. That's what we called it, the nut meat, and put it over in a cup. And when you got a cup full, you'd reach over to whatever container you're storing the nuts in and pour it in. And that would be the beginning of what good things you'd have for Christmas. Well, I'd love to tell you that you'd have pies and cakes, but young'uns, you cannot imagine how expensive sugar was. He said, why, up in the mountains of Kentucky, we didn't have any flat level land to raise sugar cane in, and this is where sugar came from at that time. What we had mostly was raw honey, and we'd start looking for honey trees out in the forest, and when you'd find one, you'd rob those trees, fight those little bees, insects, and he said you'd gather all the raw honey you could, because that's where your Christmas goodies would come from, because sugar was so expensive that if your ma and pa and your grandparents could find it anywheres, they put it in a box and locked the box to keep hungry young'uns out of it, because they knew full well that they were hankering for something sweet made out of pure cane sugar. Can you imagine what that was like at that time? He said, now, on Christmas Eve, it weren't uncommon for us to hang a stocking up, but we didn't have, at that time, any clear picture of what Santa Claus might look like. That came much, much later. Indeed, he said, there was what we call the 12 days of Christmas that started way back in the middle of December and went all the way over to the 6th day of January. That was the day the wise men were, according to the Bible, that's the day the wise men came bearing gifts from the east. There was myrrh, frankincense, and gold. Well, he said, I had never in my whole life seen much gold, and I don't even know what myrrh and frankincense is. I figure that must be stuff kind of like we might go out and gather some sweet shrub bushes and put them in a jar to let the aroma go in the house. And I knew that there was some sort of something that made people, and it was very, very expensive to buy. And so this was the time we hung them stockings up, and if we'd been good, you might find that stocking have one orange in the toe of it, and maybe 2 or 3 little bits of peppermint. You could get at the settlement store, you could buy peppermint in little pellets, and you might have 2 or 3 of those little peppermints, and if you had that much, you had a pretty good Christmas. You'd been a good boy. He said, time was so precious, though. Everywhere we turned, we was hunting for something. So people got to thinking, you know what? We ought to just write stories about and kind of make up. Well, and then is when Pap said, I met my first experience with Old Father Christmas. You know that anything at all about Old Father Christmas? Well, according to Pap, this is what he said. He said, according to what everybody said, he was the feller that kind of pried into your business during the year to see if you were good or not. And if you had been good, you might be good enough to get a nice little present like a pair of homemade gloves or a good hunting hat to pull the hat down over your ears and it would, so your ears wouldn't freeze. And then maybe, can you imagine how hard it was to get an orange from all the way from down in South America, up across the Gulf of Mexico and up the rivers? Aren't we glad that Alabama has got so many beautiful travelable rivers. And those Indians, they come up by canoe and flatboat, and they would have trade out things that they got way down in Mobile and brought it all the way up through Alabama and Tennessee. And Lord, young'uns, we certainly did get excited about having such beautiful, beautiful things in our stocking. I want to tell you one of Pap's stories. Now this here's a jack tale, and you know how I like to tell jack tales. I never have really decided where Jack was extremely smart and a hard worker or extremely slow and somebody just kind of let things happen. I'm going to let that be your decision. You might be the kind of author or kind of boy or girl that wants to write a Christmas story and make up a Jack tale of some kind. Remember now, if you go down to the library, you can find some Jack tales that are in the children's section. There's one called The Grandfather Tales that says the old man of the house who read everything told those stories. This is one of Pap's Jack tales, and it started like this. Long time ago, whilst I was living up in the mountains of Kentucky, we had the hardest winter, young'uns, you've ever seen in your life. Good heavens above, right straight out of the north, come this great storm. Weather was pretty near as unpredictable now as it's been here this year. We can't predict storms and everything because it seems like somehow the calendar of happenings kind of got jiggle-jaggled around, and we have a topsy-turvy world. Well, it was that way back then, and I'd been cutting wood for 3 solid months. Now, I don't know whether you've ever tried to keep a fire in 3 or 4 fireplaces and a big old cook stove too with wood, but you've got to cut wood day and night, day after day, and lug that wood inside and pile it out on the front porch near the front door so the snow won't cover it where you can't find it. And he says, you work, work, work. And I was sitting there one morning trying to get that fire get started, and I said, Ma, do you know what? Ma said, know what, Jack? He said, if something don't happen soon, you and I are going to freeze to death. We can't keep enough wood cut to keep us warm. And she said, that ain't the worst of our troubles, Jack. She said, you look at that barrel over in the pantry. And I looked at it and I said, Ma, where is that 100 pounds of flour we bought last summer? She said, Jack, the biscuits I made this morning, I got out of that there barrel and I scraped the bottom of the barrel. And she says, we not only are going to be short of wood, but if it doesn't something happen soon, young'un, we're liable to starve to death. It don't look like it's going to be a good year for this time, especially here with the 12 days of Christmas coming up. She said, Lord have mercy, usually by this time I've got a little bit of honey gathered and we've got enough pecans cracked for us to make a pecan cake out of it. And she says, but gracious sakes alive, we've just been so busy taking care of absolute things that we've kind of let the fancy things go to. She says, oh, Jack, well, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, you know what? A feller ought to be able to do something about this. You know what I'm going to do, Ma? She said, no, what are you going to do, Jack? I'm aiming to take Daddy's old hunting hat. You know that big one he made out of a raccoon fur? I'm going to take that and I'm going to go up to the North Pole and find the hole where that weather's coming in and ram that hat right up in that hole and stop it up so we don't freeze to death. Well, Mama said, you know what, Jack? That sounds like it might be a little harder to do than just talk about. But, Mama, I can't just sit here and freeze to death or starve. And he said, besides that, I might come into contact with old Father Christmas you told me about. Mama stopped and smiled. She said, Lord, child, you're too big and too old to think about old Father Christmas. She said, but I do remember how it was when I was a little girl, how we looked forward to Christmas time and how we looked forward to hanging our stocking. And I always thought Father Christmas was so special and so good. And she said, Jack, don't count on meeting up with old Father Christmas, though, but if you do, you tell him that Mama says hello, and I thank him for all the times he was kind to us when we were little ones. Jack says I'm going to start out early in the morning. Well, early the next morning, old Jack took out some of Pa's winter underwear, made out of solid wool, and it was as scratchy as anything you ever wore, but he thought it might save your life if you're out tromping around in the snow, and the snow being up to your knees or deeper. And he put on everything he could find, like Pa's big old hunting jacket. He hugged his Mama around the neck and said, now, Mama, I'll be back soon, afore 2 or 3 days of the 12 days of Christmas is over. Jack, mind yourself now. Be careful. You know, there's wolves and bears and things like that out in the forest. Be careful and make sure you do come home. So Jack started out tromping. Young'uns, you can't imagine how hard it was for him to walk out through the snow when the snow was deeper than from his knees down to his feet. He tromped and tromped and tromped, and he thought, goodness sakes, nobody, every time he'd meet up with somebody, he'd talk to them and ask them which way to the North Pole. And when he told them he was fixing to go up and stop the hole up where all that bad weather was coming from, they said, that poor boy, he ain't got a brain in his head. But Jack thought, if I can find that hole, I'll stop this terrible, terrible weather. So he tromped on. Well, he got down in this flat, level forest, far as you could see, tree after tree, and bush after bush. And young'uns, it had a strange kind of quietness about it. He listened, but he couldn't no way hear a bird chirping, or he couldn't tell where a fox might be scurrying along. Not any of the sounds of the forest come out. And he thought, what in the world is going on? Well, he looked down this road he was walking, and way down at the foot of the hill, he saw this old man coming up the road, pulling a sleigh, and he was walking, and he was the most peculiar-looking human being he had ever seen. Tall, thin, old as the hills himself, dressed in a long velvet green robe that went down to the ground, and it had fur on the bottom of it, and he had on big old boots and shoes, and he had a big white beard that started right at his chin and went down to the ground and kind of puddled up on the ground in front of him. And he kind of squinched his eyes when he got closer and closer and closer. And then he smiled real big. He says, well, Jack, how in the world are you, boy? Jack thought, who is this old man and how does he know me? He says, very well, sir, thank you. And he said, except I'm about to freeze to death. And he said, I sure would like to be able to know exactly where the North Pole is so as I could shut up that door where that bad weather's coming in. He said, oh, Jack, you don't really believe you're bigger than Mother Nature, do you? Well, sir, I figure somebody better do something or we're all going to either freeze to death or starve, because makings for biscuits is getting low around the house, too. And he said, sir? And he said, oh, Jack, how's your mama doing? And Jack says, well, she's not doing too well, sir. She's working hard trying to stay alive and all. I remember when she was just a little old bitty girl, she was always as nice and polite and well-mannered and knew how to act around grown-up folks just as sweet as she could be. He says, I'll tell you what, Jack. Says, when you get back home, after you decide you can't be stronger than Mother Nature, he says, you tell your mama that Father Christmas said hello and how are you? And he said, Jack, he said, I'll tell you what, if you'll help me kind of feed these little animals and all in this forest and make sure these animals don't die and all from starvation, if you'll help me, we'll go back to my house and I will give you a special present for your ma, and she or you, either one, won't have to worry one bit about what you're going to do for Christmas. Jack says, what are you doing, sir? And he said, look on that sleigh. Well, the sleigh was just loaded full of little bits of suet and all sorts of nuts and all sorts of things that little animals do. And they began to tie them on the bushes, and 'tweren't long till in a minute you could hear the squirrels begin to chatter and the birds began to chirp and the little animals began to scurry there, and they put everything out to save that whole grove of trees in the forest. And Father Christmas said, follow me, Jack. And he carried him back deep, deep, deep down into the forest. They came up on this great oak tree that looked like it was 10 stories high. And they went to, and there was a door in it. And Father Christmas went down and opened that door, and they walked in, and young'uns, it was warm inside. I'm talking you about warm enough to take your jacket off. Warm enough. Jack says, oh, Father Christmas, I hadn't even been warm since way last year when the sun was shining bright. I told you that, son. Come on in. Are you hungry? Jack took deep breaths and he said, oh, Father Christmas, I can smell food I ain't even seen in 3 or 4 months. I can smell apples and oranges and chicken and dressing and, oh, fancy things. Yes, you can. And he walked in another room and come back, and in his hand he had this great, magnificent white tablecloth. He said, now watch, Jack. And he walked over to the table and went, spread! Tablecloth, spread. And young'uns, you ain't gonna believe what happened. All of a sudden, right out of the magic of the air, that table was so loaded down with food. I'm talking food that Jack hadn't even seen some of it in his whole life, because Jack was a poor boy. Just loaded down. And Father Christmas says, welcome to the table, Jack. And Jack went over and ate and got full for the first time for months and months. Father Christmas, oh, if Mama just had some. He said, aha. And he got up from the table and he said, fold, tablecloths fold. And young'un, that food just disappeared, and that tablecloth folded itself up. And Father Christmas reached under it and picked it up, and he said, Jack, you're to take this home and give it to your mama and tell her that Father Christmas remembers how sweet and kind and gentle she was and how she always tried to tell the truth. Take it home, and y'all will never have to be hungry again, because it will last as long as you take good care of it and you wash it every once in a while and be careful, and you and your ma will make it. Sir, thank you kindly. Oh, sir, I'm beholden to you. Thank you, he said. And he said, never you mind, but listen now. With every good thing that can come along, There's responsibility this. Listen to me, Jack, and follow my instructions exactly the way I give them. He says, get up early to walk home. Keep that tablecloth under your arm to take care of it, not get careless about it and lay it down somewhere where somebody would pick it up or something. And go straight home. Don't you go lollygagging around. Don't you stop here and stop there. Go straight home, Jack, and take this to your mama and tell her I sent it to her. Oh, Jack was so excited. He left the next morning bright and early and had that tablecloth folded under his arm where he could take good care of it, and he went tromping home. But now you and I know Jack's just a kid of a boy, and he listened maybe halfway, and he didn't write stuff down, and he was walking along, and he got up over this lake, and there were 3 boys playing a game of ice hockey down on the lake. They had made them some skates, ice skates, and they took some old fruit jar lids to make a hockey puck out of, and they was playing with brooms, and they were skating here and there, 2 against 1. And Jack stood up there and watched them. He thought, they're pretty good. But I'm better than they are. I could show them a thing or two if I had time, but I ain't got time. And he started, and all of a sudden, one of the boys stopped, and he says, hey, fellers, look, yonder's somebody up there that we can come and get, and then our teams will be empty, even, 2 against 2. Hey, feller, come down and join up with us and play. Jack says, fellers, I ain't got time. In a big hurry, I'm on the way home, and I've got to go. One of them kind of nudged the other, and he said, hey, you know what? He's scared to come down and play with us because he knows we're much better than he is, and he won't want to be made fool of. And you know, boys that age don't like to be made fool of. And he said, no, fellers, besides that, I ain't got no skates. Oh, we made an extra pair because we're expecting Cousin Tom to come with us. But he didn't come. They're laying right over there by that log. Why don't you go over there and put them skates down and come show us if you ain't scared to? Well, he might as well dared him, you know, like double dog dare things. And he thought, you know what? And he didn't think one minute about what old Father Christmas has said. He walked over to that log, put that tablecloth down on the log, and pulled up them skates, them homemade skates, and put them on, and went down and started playing ice hockey with these boys and girls. Once he started, they had the best, most fun, high-heel good time. They played all evening long. And do you think Jack thought one thing seriously about some consequences of not paying attention? Now, you and I know you need to know there's consequences. But Lord have mercy. They played, and all of a sudden the oldest boy stopped and said, fellers, look, the sun is about to go down. Dad's going to kill us because we ain't done not one bit of the work that we're supposed to do. He's going to give all 3 of us a whooping like you ain't never had. And they said, hey, Jack, come home with us and spend the night. If you come with us, Dad won't be liable to give us a whooping. We might get in trouble, but he won't give us a whooping, I don't think. Well, there's a difference being punished and getting a whooping. And Jack thought, you know what? He said, no, fellers, I got to hurry on. I got to get home before dark. They said, oh, you don't need to go through them woods there in the dark. There's wolves, and there's bear, and things that just walk in the dark that we don't know what they are. Don't nobody go through them woods at night, and night is coming on quick as that. So Jack decided he would go home. They walked a spell and started up this hillside, and there was a kind of shanty up there, and there was a man sitting on the front step, rocking. Oh, you could tell that man was angry. He looked like maybe a volcano about to erupt, and he said, "Well, it's about time you young'uns decided to go home. Them chickens ain't been fed, them cows ain't been watered." And he began to name off this, and he says, "And you're fixing to get the whooping of your life." And they grabbed poor old Jack and put him out in front, and they said, "Sir, we got company come to spend the night, and he's hungry." "Well, he's come to a poor place to be hungry," he said. And Jack, who had put the tablecloth back under his arm, he says, "Could I ask you, sir, why it'd be a poor place to be hungry?" "'Cause we ain't hardly got nothing left in our pantry, that's why. And you've come to a dry hole to get a drink in." And Jack says, "Sir, I'd be glad to provide supper if you don't mind." The man says, "What you talking about, boy?" He says, "Well, if you don't mind, I'd use your dining table." So they went inside, and Jack walked in and went, "Spread!" Tablecloth spread, and like it had done the night before, again the table was just loaded down with food, good Christmas food. And those boys and that pop, eyes got big as saucers. And that man, now you know, strangers are not always what we expect them to be. We expect them to be honest and trustworthy and dependable and such like as that. Well, this man thought, "Ooh, if I had that tablecloth, me or my boys would never have to work again." And he changed immediately. Watch folks do that. He said, "Why, young man, Jack, ain't that your name?" "Yes, sir." "Jack, you're just as welcome as a day in spring." He said, "Come right on in." And he said, "Boys, put Jack a pallet down right in front of the fire over there so's he could sleep warm tonight." He said, "Jack, you get over there and rest. I know you're tired." He says, "I tell you what, put that piece of tablecloth under your head so you'll feel real secure about it." So old Jack got on that pallet in front of the fire and put his tablecloth under his head, and it wasn't 5 minutes. If you've ever played all day till you couldn't hardly move, you're so tired. That's the way old Jack was. And in 5 minutes, he was sound asleep. And the old man did this to his boys. And he walked over and took another tablecloth that looked just like the one Jack had put under his head, and he reached down and he ooched that tablecloth from under Jack's head, and ooched that other one back in its place. And the next morning, when Jack waked up, do you think he even recognized one bit that weren't the same tablecloth? He got up and shook the man's hand and thanked the boys and said, "Thank you kindly, sir. I got to hurry home because my mama is hungry and needs to eat." And he took off. And sure enough, he got back home. Well, when Mama saw him a-coming, she had a fit. Oh, she went down, and she was so glad to see her boy come home and safe. She hugged him up good. "Come inside, come inside." He said, "Mama, you ain't going to believe what I did and what I saw." She said, "Well, it's certainly you didn't stop the weather, because the wind's still a-blowing and the snow is still a-falling, and we're still hungry." And he said, "Look here, Mama." And he handed her the tablecloth. She said, "Jack, ooh, that's the finest material I ever seen." I can cut that up and make you a Sunday golden meeting shirt in that. And he said, oh, Mama, watch. And he went over to the table. Spread! Tablecloth spread. Just as you're predicting. Nothing happened. He said, but Mama, I met up with old Father Christmas and he remembered you. And he said, Mom, she said, oh, Lord, Jack. And she reached over to see if he had a fever or was talking out of his. She said, Jack, you didn't see no Father Christmas. And Jack, she said, and she gave him a dose of castor oil. Now, you may not remember castor oil, but when I was a child, if somebody had to give me a dose of castor oil, young'uns, that was about as bad a thing that could ever happen because that's the foulest taking stuff. But old Jack took that dose and went to bed. And he began to fret. What did I do? What did I do? And so he thought it had to do with what Father Christmas told me and how I ignored what he had to say and made up my own rules to go by. And folks, you can't do this in this old world. If there's rules to follow and things you got to do, you've got to pay attention and do what you're supposed to do. So Jack popped up out of that bed and he said, Mama, I'm going back. I'm going to find Father Christmas and tell him what I'd done and apologize. Well, his mama tried her best to persuade him not to go. But bound and determined he was, and you know how it is. Once a little boy that age gets his mind made up, he dressed real warmly and started out. Well, on the way north, looking for the North Pole and Father Christmas, he ran into Father Christmas again in a little village. And he was pulling another sleigh, and this time it was loaded up with wood tied in little bits and pieces. And he said, Jack, why ain't you at home enjoying the 12 days of Christmas? He said, Father Christmas, when I got home, the tablecloth wouldn't work. And he hung his head. Because Jack had a pretty good idea of what he had done was wrong. And he said, Jack, did you go lollygagging around? Did you waste your time and not listen to direction? Oh, Father Christmas, he said, I didn't pay attention well enough and I didn't follow directions. He said, Jack, young'uns like you quite often get into trouble because you don't pay attention. He said, I'll tell you what, help me give all this wood out to all these widow ladies and old folks that can't get out and cut. If we get all this village taken care of, come home with me tonight and I'll send your mother another present. Jack thought, what in the world could it possibly be? If that tablecloth was magic, reckon what? Well, all day long, they put wood on folks' doorstep where folks didn't have to go out and go through the cold to bring it in. And they worked real hard and went back to Father Christmas. When they got in there, Jack enjoyed the house being warm and he didn't have to go cut wood and things. So indeed, he said, Jack, ain't you and your mama got no money at all? Sir, if we had 2 dimes, they wouldn't make any noise because they'd be imaginary dimes. We ain't got no money at all. He thought, my, if you only had money. And he went out to the hen house and got this little rooster, about that high, Benny rooster, pretty feathers and walking around like he was the cock of the walk. And Jack said, sir, if I take that home to Mama, she's going to wring its neck and make chicken and dumplings. And Mama makes the best chicken and dumplings you ever tasted. No, Jack, look. And he put that rooster down on the table and he said, lay, rooster, lay, and pointed at it. And young'uns, Jack killed over life and he said, Father Christmas, that's a rooster. Roosters don't lay eggs. He said, and in a minute, that rooster got up and there was a solid gold egg. He said, feel of it, Jack. And it was as heavy. He said, Lord of mercy, Father Christmas, ain't that worth a powerful bit of money? Indeed, he said, take this home to your mama. And remember, whatever you do, don't stop and play and waste your time. And don't just trust everybody you see, he said. And so Jack picked up the little Benny rooster and made up his mind, I ain't going to have nothing to do with no boys. I ain't going to go to no old house. Well, now the father of the boys knew when things were well off or not well off. And he thought, if that boy ever comes back up here, I'm going to trick him and get whatever he's got. So he set the boys out on the road where Jack would probably walk, and sure enough, before it came along, here he come down the road, and he was a whistling and a singing, thinking about all them golden eggs and how he'd never have to work hard again. When one of the boys stepped out and said, Jack, Pa said you might be coming this way and asked you just to come by and say hello. Well, what the old man had done was make up a pot of hot chocolate, that good kind of chocolate, you know, and even put marshmallows in it. And he said, but he also put a little bit of sleepy powder in it. Now, you and I know not to just take anything to drink from somebody without knowing what it's made out of and everything. But Jack says, nope, I'm on my way home and I ain't going to. Well, the old man walked down the road. He said, Jack, I figured as to how you'd be so busy you wouldn't want to come by the house again. And he says, I'm sorry you had trouble with that there tablecloth, but that's the way things happen sometimes. But I do want you to have this fine cup of hot chocolate to get you on your way. Well, now, Jack was kind of favorable toward chocolate. He liked it better than he liked anything else to eat. Oh, he could smell it, and he could see them little marshmallows floating on the top. And he reached over and got that cup of hot chocolate and chug-a-lugged it right down and bid that old man farewell and started walking. And when he did, he fell over asleep. Right smack dab there in the middle of the road. He fell asleep. And the old man, get him quick. And they took him up to the house, and they went outside to their hen house and got a little rooster that looked just like the one Jack had, and he brought it back and put it in Jack's arms. Well, Jack didn't sleep but about an hour or so, and he waked up and he looked real quick, and there was his rooster still resting in his arm, still looking real proud of himself, he thought. And he thanked the old man and went on. Well, of course, you know when he got home what it was like. The woman came out and hugged her son and welcomed him home. And she said, Jack, it's nigh on to the 12th to Christmas Eve. She said, you promised me you'd take me to the barn to see the animals when they come to worship the Christ child right at the stroke of midnight from here. And he said, Mama, I will, but look, we ain't never going to have to work again. And he put the little rooster down and he said, lay, rooster, lay. Well, of course, as you're predicting, nothing happened. And Jack thought, what did I do? What did I do? And he had a glimmer of what the hot chocolate he had drunk. In fact, he could kind of stick his tongue out on the cheek there and taste a little of that hot chocolate where he'd kind of run down there. He said, oh, what will I ever learn that I can't trust everybody, that everybody's not got the good of mankind in mind. And he told his mama, he said, Mama, I got to go back and find Father Christmas again. She begged him not to go, but Jack was determined, and he started trudging through the cold. Well, of course, it was Christmas Eve. And young'uns, did you know that right at the stroke of midnight, every Christmas Eve, all over the world. The animals in the stable fall to their knees, and the Christ child comes just for a little while, just to bring a little bit of joy and a little bit of pleasure and a little bit of responsibility and a little bit of respect, bringing the really important presents of Christmas time. And so he was walking through this wood, and he saw this beautiful barn. And when he looked in the door, and there stood old Father Christmas, and in his hand he had a pine stick, like a walking stick, all gnarled and not very pretty and ugly, but he had that in his hand, and Jack looked, and he could see that stick was a-trembling, because just at the stroke of midnight, that moon come out from behind a cloud, and the light came from above into that barn over the stable and the manger. And the Father Christmas dropped the stick into the manger. And it stayed there, and then all of a sudden, about 5 minutes, that moon left, and Father Christmas looked down and smiled. He said, "Jack, you right." He said, "I don't have another gift, but this gift is from the Christ child itself, and it's the staff of truth and justice. And he told me to tell you to go back to that man's house and get the gifts he had sent to your mama. And to remember, you've got to be a responsible person." And Jack could see that stick, and he thought, what in the world can that old stick do? It ain't even pretty. It's just kind of gnarled and rusty looking and kind of moldy looking. But he picked it up, and it felt like it was alive in his hand. He said, "As long as somebody tells you true," he said, "it'll stay in your hand, and you can feel the energy that's in it. But," he said, "beware of the person who lies. Make the old man give you back your table and the rooster." So Jack took the staff of truth in his hand, and he marched, young'uns, right back up that hillside to that cabin on the hill. Well, the old man saw him a-coming, and had already hid everything and tucked everything away. And he went out and sat down on the front porch, and he said, "Jack, you back, are you? What have you got with you this time?" Jack held up, he said, "Sir, I've got the staff of truth and justice. And this time it ain't from Father Christmas, but the Christ child that sent it. And he said to tell you to give me back my tablecloth and give me back my rooster." "Oh, Jack," said the man, "how could you be so unkind and accuse me of taking stuff that don't belong? Why, I wouldn't for anything under the sun harm you or anything that belonged to you." Well, Jack could feel that staff begin to shake and tremble. Young'uns, it jumped right out of that Jack's hand, and it began to whail. Now, it didn't just whip. It whaled and whooped that old man as he started running. "Jack, make it stop. Make it stop." He said, "I can't make it stop. You've got to make it stop by telling the truth." Well, here come the boys to help their pa, and the staff began to whip them too, and they began to run and holler. And so finally the old man realized. He said, "Make it stop. Jack, I promise you, I'll give you back your tablecloth, and I'll give you back your rooster." And when he said that with truth in it, the staff noted, and it jumped back in Jack's hand. And the old man went into the house and got his tablecloth, and went out to the hen house and got the little rooster. And Jack carried it home. Well, indeed, he and his mama lived a very good life. But he was always reckoned on by all the people of the mountains in the area about that he was a judge because he always knew when somebody was lying, and he always knew how to make them feel about correcting the ways, because it wasn't uncommon for people to be brought in front of Judge Jack, and that staff would start trembling, and it wasn't too uncommon for it to jump out of Jack's hand and start wailing the living daylights right out of somebody that had no concept. Jack went back home, and he and Ma lived a very good life, and they had things that they had, but they always remembered there are responsibilities that come along with things that go, you've got to listen, you've got to pay attention, and you've got to feel love in your heart for your fellow man. But in that light, you've got to remember that you can't always trust everybody you meet also. But anyway, Pap laughed and said, now what did you think about that Christmas story? And I said, Pap, I've got one that was written by a friend. His name was Clement Moore, and Clement was having a hard time financial. In fact, it was Christmas time, and he had 4 little young'uns that was expecting a lot. He thought, what can I do? Well, he had no money, but he did have something he could use. He had talent. He could write the most beautiful words you ever heard, and he could tell a story really, really well, and he could draw. And this is what he did for his children. And you're going to recognize it. Now I'm going to use my anthology of Christmas Untold Under the Christmas Tree. I hope I can tell it to you, but I may get kind of confused. Remember, I'm getting to be an old woman, and sometimes I forget what I'm doing. I'm going to try to tell it to you because this is my favorite thing to read to boys and girls. And it's called 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. And it goes like this. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes old St. Nicholas soon would be there. And the children were nestled all snug in their bed, while visions of sugar plums danced in their head. And Mama in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled down for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang up from my bed to see what was the matter. I ran to the window, and quick as a flash, tore open the shutters, threw up the sash. Oh, the moon, how it glistened on the new fallen snow, gave a luster of midday to objects below. And what to my wondering eyes should appear? A miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so jolly and quick that I knew in a moment that must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles, the coursers they came. He whistled, he shouted, he called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, Donner and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to top of the wall. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all. And just like leaves that in front of a wild hurricane flight, when it met with an obstacle, the sleigh went up to the sky, and then in a twinkling, I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. And he had a sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And as I drew in my head and was turning around, St. Nicholas came down the chimney with a bound. Oh, my goodness sakes alive. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes he kept brushing for ashes and soot. And he had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. Oh, his eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks was like roses, his nose like a cherry, and his droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. And a bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. A droll little pipe he had like tight in his teeth, and the smoke came out and encircled his head like a wreath. He was chubby and kind of fat, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. But a wink of his eye and a nod of his head soon gave him to know I had nothing to dread. Indeed, he walked to the chimney, and laying a finger aside of his nose, giving a nod up the chimney, he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team, gave a whistle, and away they flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all good night." Clement Moore became a very wealthy man because of this poem. You go to the store today to buy a children's book on Christmas, most likely you'll pick up something that has "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," because this is where our concept of Santa is told to us today. If I draw Santa Claus with a red hat and fur, then you're going to have the idea, because you have a concept that's given to you in about 120 years ago. And people today recognize it everywhere. Thank you, and Merry, Merry Christmas from my house to you, and from my heart to you.